Welcome to everybody. I'm Leslie Stevenson. I'm the publisher of Governance. And welcome to our seminar, our webinar, looking at how boards can act courageously to make the right decisions in turbulent times. I think we can all agree that these are pretty turbulent times. And we want this session to be very interactive. So if you could raise any questions or comments in the Q&A, because then Zoom records it and we can keep them for afterwards, that would be great. We're going to start with our panelists having a little conversation amongst themselves for 15-20 minutes. And then we'll open it out to all of you because we do want to get as much of your feedback as possible. And I can see, Christopher, you've raised your hand, but I'm not quite sure what to do about that. I think you have to put any comment you have has to go in the Q&A because it's been set up as a webinar. But please do put anything in the Q&A. So we're really lucky to have our three panelists. I'm very sorry to say that Ali Gill, who was going to be our fourth panelist, is not able to join us because she's unwell at the last minute. But we have three very esteemed panelists who all have an enormous amount of experience of working with a number of companies through doing board reviews and other board work with them. And so that's going to come into real effect in the conversations they're having. They're talking about real companies and real situations. They're all founder members of the Board Effectiveness Guild, which has been set up to try and improve board effectiveness, to raise the conversation, enhance the value by sharing best practice and contributing to the wider discussion. The session is being recorded and we will send the recording out to all of you. And we're also having an article written for the June issue of Governance based on what comes out of this recording. So we're hoping it's going to be a really useful interactive session. So with no further ado, I am going to pop the first question to our panelists, and I'm going to ask Chris to start, just because I am. And the first question is, in your experience, how well are boards responding to the current geopolitical, technological, and economic challenges that they're going through? Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Leslie. Good afternoon, everybody. I think it's easy to see the sort of turbulent times as something that sort of started in January when the Trump administration took office in the United States. But I think actually, the challenges have been sort of developing for some time, and I think I would say I see this in sort of two areas when talking to boards and particularly doing board reviews. One is in the discussion about how boards approach risk. And the second I'll come on to in a minute is sort of how the boards think about composition. And in terms of risk, I think what I'm seeing is a sort of an increasing awareness that the areas of risk that are emerging and sort of developing in the consciousness of boards are really proliferating not only in the sort of geopolitical area, but also in the sort of technological area. When you think about areas like cyber and AI and data, all of those things. When you look at the sort of economic pressures, the pressures that come from international trade, and the list, goes on and on. And I think the challenge for boards is really to be able to understand these sort of emerging areas of risk, sort of get on top of them, and really be able to formulate a view on what they should do about that. And I think that then feeds into the sort of second area, which is really what are the competencies that boards feel they need around the board table. I think the discussion tends to look at how the board is made up, what are the skill sets or the experience that they need in the future. But it could be sort of extended more broadly than that as to how do we get the knowledge into the boardroom, whether it's through the membership of the board or more how the board works through, let's say, working groups or subcommittees and so on. So I think this is an area where boards are very very aware. Um, I'm not so sure how the regulators are sort of approaching this whole area. I mean, the FRC and others obviously have been focusing on reporting around risks and controls, particularly through the most recent changes to the UK Corporate Governance Code. Um, but I think it is an area where the regulatory environment probably still needs to catch up a little bit. But certainly, to go back to my sort of main point, the boards themselves, I think, are very aware of the issues and really having to figure out how they can sort of accommodate some serious consideration of those issues within the bandwidth that they have as boards of directors.
Thank you. Ian, can I move on to you next?
Yeah, thank you, Leslie, and welcome everyone. I'm tempted to say that boards are dealing with these your geopolitical and technology and economic risks rather like the rest of us, with a huge degree of uncertainty. And I think that there are obviously some major challenges for boards and some difficulties. I think effective boards uh, know that they can't know everything, and so they are having to navigate with that uncertainty, and understanding that there can be choppy times ahead, there can be difficulties, but they've got to keep going. So it's why I said at the beginning, I think boards are dealing with this like the rest of us. I know from a personal perspective, I think we live in a very uncertain world, and therefore predictability becomes, and elements of control become all that more difficult. And so I think we talked about having courage in this seminar. I think one of the things that really effective boards are doing, or really effective non-executive directors, is having that degree of courage, to deal with the unknown, the uncertain. So I think the first thing to say is you just can't know everything. I think the second thing is that boards are having to deal very much more closely with the executive team, and when non-execs can be of huge value in these times of uncertainty, is to take more of a mentoring role. And certainly the effective boards I see, or the most effective boards I see, that there is that good degree of mentoring between the non-execs and the executives, and indeed below the exco level as well. Obviously, Neds need to ensure they're not operational, but actually having people who've lived through difficult times in the past, I think can be hugely valuable. I think thirdly, really absolutely knowing the company well. And I think one of the challenges for Neds now, and challenge for boards, but challenges for Neds in particular, is that it's going to become a more time-consuming role. And it's already pretty time-consuming if you're particularly in a regulated sector, for example. But I think that will just increase. Uh, I think the areas that Chris has mentioned, AI. One of the things I've noticed is, particularly when I talk to executives, and especially when I talk to the chief information officer, do boards really know enough, not just about AI, but digital and IT? I still think that's an area of weakness. We've had some obviously major issues with well-known names with cyber attacks recently, and that's certainly something that's on the top of boards' agendas. But that is quite a common comment: is do we have enough non-execs who really know enough about that area? So I think that's one to really focus on. So I think really in a way, it's more of the same. I think effective boards are dealing with these uncertainties. If they're effective, they're doing it in doing more of the same, and making sure they're close to the company, not too close, obviously close to the NEDs, and having that mentoring role.
Thanks very much, Ian. Alex.
Hi, hello everyone. Yeah, I'd agree with what Chris and Ian have said. And what I would add is a sense of catching up in boards just now. In board reviews that I've been involved with in the last 6 months or so, NEDs talking about we really need to spend more time actually, and we need to, perhaps to use the courage word, we need to take the risk of actually looking once again at our strategy what is sustainable over time and where do things need to change in the light of either government changes, digital technology changes, supply chain changes. So I think there's a kind of appetite in boards to have enough time to explore this in a little bit more detail and not just press on with the strategy we've had and in a changed circumstance. I think the courage comes from NEDs who are prepared to actually stand up at board meetings and actually say, hold on, I think we need to think again. We need to reflect once more.
So do you think that's leading to more short-termism in decision making?
I think it's leading to both actually. I think short-termism is happening because people are tactically trying to cope to respond to circumstances. But that's squeezing out some of the more expansive conversation that leads to the longer term thinking on strategy. So, for example, I've got a board just now, which is government owned, new government, completely different stakeholder need, shareholder need from the past. But they've ended up, and they are self-critical of it, they're kind of just responding to the shareholder rather than saying, what do we think? What's our take on this? How do we apply our expertise as NEDs and execs to the overall objectives of the shareholder? So that does lead to a kind of short-term responsiveness.
And I'm quite interested, both Chris and Ian mentioned, and actually Chris and I have had conversations about this offline, sort of how you prepare your board for these new things, sort of cyber AI, all the rest of it. Is it better to get a non-executive director with all that experience, but is a non-executive director who's got extensive experience in one area able to really help with the board as a whole? I'm just interested in what you all think about that.
Yeah, I think there's a need to co-opt a little bit more and not necessarily expect NEDs. I speak as someone of a particular age, and NEDs tend to be older, and we might need to bring in, there's a demographic issue here around the whole digital agenda for me, and where I've seen boards thrive is to have a co-opted expert that they bring in to the board at certain points for those conversations.
They're not a board member as such, but an individual.
Not necessarily, because it's too difficult sometimes to find them, but you can get access to expertise.
I think I would add to that the nature of a sort of unitary board means that directors shouldn't be subject area experts alone, but should be participating in a collegiate environment in a board. And I think this sort of issue becomes far more critical where you have smaller boards, which, if you look beyond the sort of FTSE 350 companies, you are getting into the sort of 5, 6, 7 member boards, which if you say, well, we need a sort of IT specialist amongst those 7 members, by the time you've got a CEO and a CFO and a chair, that's a lot of sort of board capacity taken up with one particular subject. So I think you have to be sort of clever in the way that you approach that and not sort of just assume that because it's a really important issue, it demands that you have a board member who sort of is the specialist in that alone. And I agree with that. I think you've got to sort of broaden the way in which the board actually engages with these subjects. And I think there is value also actually in engaging in a way where it isn't just a non-exec or that is engaging, but it's more of a joint effort between the non-execs and the execs. I think that's, for me, why to discuss sort of working groups of the board where you can bring in the relevant people in a slightly different way of discussing issues is a really useful thing to be thinking about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I'd agree with those comments. I do think it's sector specific to some extent. If we talk not just about AI, but also, the sort of current, or well, not current, but fairly recent enthusiasm to have somebody with digital or IT background. I mean, I often ask about future skills for the board, and that's the answer I get. And then you dig down to what exactly is meant, and it's not so clear. So I agree with Chris. You can't have subject matter experts. I think if you're an online retailer, those skills are going to be much more relevant than to some sectors where you don't have such an online presence. I know most organisations do as well, but I think sector is important on that. I think because this goes out of date, so this type of skill goes out of date so quickly. If you're going to have a non-exec with this particular skill base, then you probably better to have a current executive elsewhere sitting on the board as a NED, and that can obviously be a challenge. So I personally think it's better to look at this because things are so fast moving to have expert speakers, advisory boards, or advisory councils rather than having a non-executive director doing this. I've also noticed that on occasion boards have recruited a non-exec with an IT digital background because the CIO is weak, and that definitely is something I think boards should avoid. And obviously the objective there is to change the CIO, not try and bolster the experience by getting a NED to fill in for them. So I think that's one thing to watch.
Thank you. So, in your experience, because this is what we're all here for, is your experiences. Have you got any examples of how you've worked with boards trying to deal with volatility? Has it increased? Are they asking you more questions, or?
Yeah, yeah, definitely, Leslie. They are asking more questions. Um, uh, they're um, they're thirsty for scenario planning sessions. Okay. And more now than I think I've ever seen. Because they've learned, bitterly over the last 12 months that things can change radically. And they want to test out scenarios. They don't want just to be delivered a draft strategy from the execs and they have the conversation and they sign it off. The NEDs want more. They want more engagement. And I think the NEDs can add a heck of a lot more value in those conversations because they don't have blinkers on. So more scenario planning, certainly picking up on Chris's earlier point, much more on reviewing risk, and more particularly on engaging with stakeholders, particularly shareholders, but also sometimes with staff and things too, and regulators if they're applicable. But the stakeholder relationship is terribly dynamic now compared with perhaps how it was in the past. And the perturbations from the US in the market have an impact on shareholder behavior. So I think getting closer to what your shareholders are really wanting and how they're responding to a dynamic environment too.
I think perhaps if I could just go back to Alex's comments on the risk. One of the things I'm seeing with a lot of boards that when I talk about sort of the discussion around risk is a sort of dissatisfaction with the sort of formalities that boards have to go to when they report, principal risks and uncertainties, which tend to go down a fairly prescribed route for board discussion and sort of board approval. And I think this is actually a particular issue where you have boards that generally don't meet very often, perhaps quarterly, And if you think that, every other meeting you're then approving a statement of sort of principal risks and uncertainties, it kind of locks the discussion around risk into a very sort of formulaic reporting cycle. And the frustration that I find boards are voicing when I talk to them is a need to actually break out of that and look at the sort of risk world holistically. And I think this is where the time that the board spend together becomes a critical factor. It's so much more difficult when you've only got quarterly meetings, and a good proportion of that quarterly agenda is taken up with approving announcements or approving annual reports or whatever. And the boards that actually do perhaps a little better on this, the ones that A, meet more regularly, and B, actually have the offline time to look at this, to Alex's point, sort of linked into strategy discussions, offsites, so that they can kind of really get their heads around these sorts of things in a much more holistic way, and are less driven by the sort of must-dos of whatever regulatory requirement they're sort of trying to tick off.
Yeah.
I think boards, NEDs in particular, have to be quite careful here. I think there's a huge temptation in these challenging times to get more involved, and the risk is there to start one, to act operationally, and two, to interfere in the wake of a busy management team that has enough to deal with as it is, and if the non-execs aren't careful, I think they can start to be a distraction on that. So I agree that non-execs and boards have to work more closely and be close to the business and know what's going on. But I think there is a danger here of being too involved. So I'll give you an example. I've made a recommendation in quite a few reviews where I've suggested that, not the type of boards that Chris is talking about that meet quarterly, but it's not uncommon for a FTSE small cap or 250 to meet 10 or 11 times a year. And I recommended they cut the numbers of meetings down. I think that's a huge amount of work for the executives to deal with. They're there to run the business, and I think we need to remember that. The role of the board is critically important. It isn't there to run the business. It is there for the executive team to do that. So I think that's the first thing I'd say. I think second thing, I think effective boards are dealing with all these type of issues more regularly. I did a review a couple of years ago where the chair and the CEO didn't want a strategy day every year because, as they rightly say, strategy is dealt with at every board meeting. It's not a once a year event that we then go away and write up, what our strategy is. And I think the same is true of risk. I mean, of course, you should be dealing with, risk in dealing with principal risks and uncertainties, and getting regular reports from the risk committee. But again, the board needs to be dealing with that regularly. So these aren't sort of extra items. They should be clearly on the board's agenda all the time. That
So
probably
you,
sounds slightly counterintuitive, but from what I've said to begin with.
Yeah, I kind of don't fully agree with you. I think that what I was talking about was the amount of time in the board meeting in order to give space and oxygen to think differently, to the point of this webinar, to enable the courageous ideas to come forward, and all that procedural reviewing risks, reviewing, strategies and things. Yes, of course, that needs to carry on and be done. But I'm just reflecting back what I'm hearing from NEDs who are saying we want that not to get involved in the operational detail of the business, actually to give everyone time to stand back and to reflect in a very dynamic world. How is this affecting our business going forward, and where's the opportunity in it as well? Because kind of never waste a good crisis.
No, but I think too many boards treat strategy as once a year
Some
event.
do.
I'm
Yeah,
saying
I
so.
agree with you there, Ian.
So
Yeah, I agree with you there. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't
And
go along with it.
I agree. I do agree with you, Ian, that 10 or 11 meetings a year is a huge burden
Oh
on
yeah.
the team putting together the papers and the agenda. So I wouldn't recommend that. But I do feel um, that it is about the time that and the quality of the time that you spend on the discussion rather than necessarily the burden you're putting on the executives. And I think there's a balance in how you treat the formality of the board meeting versus other discussion. And I'm, quite a few times in my recommendations to board, I've talked about using the time that's not in that sort of formal minuted meeting, whether it's a board dinner or a site visit or whatever, to actually use the time to engage more less formally around these issues. Um, and to Alex's point, I think those are the opportunities where board members can sort of say the unthinkable and voice the contrary opinion that is all about being a challenge to groupthink, which is really what sort of the underlying theme of this particular webinar. So, I think there are lots of ways of thinking about this, and in board reviews in the past, I think it's been easy just to gloss over the questions about, are there enough meetings? Are the meetings long enough? Are the papers long enough? These are all sort of hygiene factors in a sense, but actually they can make a big difference to the quality if you get them right compared to if you get them wrong in terms of board discussion. And so that's why I would come back to that and challenge boards to rethink through how they're using those aspects of their governance framework.
So are you getting the feeling that executives and non-executives are beginning to work in a different way, in a better way, or not?
It depends really, Leslie. I think it's that working together, that collaboration. There's a designed intention between execs and non-execs. It's there for a good reason. Um, uh, where you see it working best usually starts with the relationship between the chair and the chief executive. If that works really well, then it cascades down a bit. Um, uh, I think I think in the most courage, if courage is around honesty, okay, in the boardroom, then the best boards, execs and non-execs working together, have the most honest conversations. So is that happening more? I hope so. I can't evidence it, kind of to be sure, but the best boards certainly do.
I think that the sort of traditional view of a board meeting where the sort of Neds turn up and may or may not have opened the board pack before they got there
That's kind of fun.
is very much a thing of the past. I
Yeah.
think most Neds that I come across, A, take their jobs very seriously, and B, are recognizing that their time pressure on their time is increasing in the sense that they are needing to devote more time. Partly that's being driven by increased expectations. For example, the sort of whole focus on the employee or workforce stakeholder has brought NEDs into sort of site meetings and in works councils or whatever it is. But also recognition that if they are to do their job properly and, understand these sort of new risk areas, they have got to put more time into, reading the papers, but talking to the executives and, making it their business to understand. And that there is a temptation there, as Ian has highlighted, that you end up with Neds putting a huge amount of burden on the management team, particularly if they're all engaged in sort of bilateral conversations. And I think the chair actually has quite a key role to play in sort of not sort of controlling that environment, because you don't want dialogue to be constrained and sort of falsely managed, as it were. but ensuring that it doesn't get out of hand, and the CEO is forever answering emails from the Neds when they've got a business to run. So the dynamic has definitely changed. I think there is a responsibility on Neds to figure out how they you know use their time to get themselves up to speed, but not at the expense of the sort of whole thing grinding to a halt for sort of governance reasons.
Yeah.
That actually brings us to
Well,
one
can I
appropriate
just
one of our questions. Sorry, Ian, did you want
I
to say?
was just going to I reiterate what's said about the chair. Um, and again, I think things have, but again, more effective boards are where the Neds are taking on that mentoring role. I don't just mean where, for example, the chair of the audit committee is acting as a mentor to the CFO, but they actually go outside of their traditional areas of expertise. So you've built that relationship up, and indeed, I've seen really effective mentoring relationships between Neds and more junior executives. As I say, below executives. I think the other way, and this would be a plea from me to any Neds on the webinar, is to be more visible and to get to know the business more. Well, not obviously operationally, but just walk around more and try and get. It comes back to what Chris has said about employee engagement. I still see non-execs who don't really engage with the business as a whole, don't go around and meet employees. So I think that's a really important thing to do. Sorry, I interrupted you, but
No, 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 absolutely no. That was an important point to make. So we've got a question here from Maureen, who's asking at this point, if Neds are increasingly required to understand the whole business and talk work in the way you've been mentioning, Chris, do you think that's an opportunity or a hurdle to board recruitment? To make the role
Um,
or less?
I don't think it's necessarily a hurdle. I mean, I think it's a hurdle if you've got someone wanting to join a board who really is only prepared to offer sort of 4 days a year around 4 quarterly meetings. But to be quite honest, I don't think many people are looking to join boards to make with that sort of time commitment in mind. I think there is an awareness now that if you join a board, you've got to commit, more time than just whatever number of days is required for the board meetings. I think the investor focus of recent years on overboarding has has sort of reached a point where it is in the subconscious of a lot of people involved in boards, and they are kind of seeing, maybe four is more than enough, or enough. And therefore, how do I use my time fully on those, three, four, five boards rather than just sort of shoehorn it into a sort of very busy diary. So I think the discussion is more honest about that now. I think there is an appetite amongst Neds to feel that they have access to the company or the organization, and that they do have the ability to go and do a site visit off their own back, or something like that. And in fact, almost see that as a sort of cultural indicator of the company, that the CEO does allow them to go and do that, rather than sort of try and chaperone them everywhere, and sort of edit what it is that they find on their travels. So I think there is a reality check there that a lot of Neds, I think, just are factoring into their decision making.
Yeah. Neds are very aware now that the amount of time in the initial contract is not the amount of time that they'll need to spend. And it's probably times two. Um, I agree with Chris. The number of Neds you see that are on multiple boards is much less than it used to be. Much less. There's much more seats, and it's a bigger job. It carries more weight now than it did, 10 years ago.
Ian.
yeah, no, I think it can be it can be an opportunity, but I think it can be a hurdle to taking on Ned roles. And I think people mentioned the time commitment. I've never interviewed a Ned yet who said, because I always ask about, how long does your role take a year? I've never met a Ned yet who says, oh, less than in the letter of appointment. It is always much more than that, and it can be considerably more than that. So, and I think what Neds have to be careful about when or potential Neds when they take on a role is that, in your first year, it's likely to be more intensive than as usual, because you're getting to know the business. You may be getting to know the sector as well. So you've got to allow more time for that. And if it's, let's say, 30 days a year, that is when everything is going okay. If there's a crisis, you're in an M&A, then it can be considerably enhanced. You can 2 or 3 times the time that you would expect to be involved. I mean, I've done a couple of boards in crises, and people are working a lot of hours. And although you're non-executive, you are getting much more involved than you would necessarily be. So, I think it can be a hurdle. I did a review a couple of years ago where one Ned had 4 roles, none in financial services. But as he said to me, I can just about do this, but I can't. It is tight. And again, if you're chairing a board effectively, so you're going for the role of the chair, then your time commitment is considerably more. I mean, for a FTSE 250, it can be anything from 50 to 100, 120 days, depending on how much involvement you want. So I think it can be a hurdle. I think it can be, there are great opportunities. I do agree most Neds take it seriously and make the time commitment, particularly those in regulated industries where they may have to be approved, and reputational issues will cause them huge challenges
We've had another
getting
question
future
about
roles.
that based on, sorry,
Yeah,
Ian.
yeah, go no, that's yeah, I've finished.
We had another question about that. What's the risk of board members wandering around the business and the employees? And it says here, board inserting itself into operations. Well, we all know the board shouldn't insert itself into operations, but is there a risk with,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
how would you alleviate that risk?
I think there is a risk, okay, that certain Neds, particularly maybe some that are inexperienced, or some that have got a particular agenda or whatever, or particular enthusiasm, will want to kind of get more involved, and then we end up with them in the executive space, really. I do think that boards, um, with the whole employee engagement thing, should have a bit of a plan, okay, around this. People should know kind of what's expected of the role, and if people are doing, kind of visits on their own things, that is reported back on, and things. It shouldn't become a kind of everyone kind of just plowing their own furrow on this. It's got to be, and I like to see boards with plans, in order to watch that the non-executives don't disturb the executive operation and the executive collective leadership.
I, I,
Uh,
I,
uh,
so, I mean, I slightly disagree with this. I mean, I think effective boards and effective Neds really know the mandate, and I think it's really important, for non-executive, not just to stay within the confines of the boardroom. And although you can have informal breakfasts or lunches, you're bringing employees onto your territory. And so I think that makes it quite difficult. When I was a GC in COSAC, I always used to say to my Neds, walk around the building, get to soak up the culture. That most of them are sensible enough to not to go and ask somebody in junior in HR what they think of the CEO. I think just getting to know employees, I think, is really important. Certainly when I speak to employees about how visible the board is, they're always saying we'd like to see more of the non-exec. So I think getting to know the culture, getting to know the people is important. I think the danger is more in the boardroom, and I see it much more from non-execs perhaps interfering in the lives of executives within the boardroom space. So I think actually getting to soak up the culture and learning about the organisation that way is really important. So and again, I agree with Alec about being clear on what the mandate is. I mean, I always say to a lot of boards where I do the board review is have a a session once a year. How do we best work together, and that can be part of that. So I think I absolutely agree that the ground rules have to be set, but the more you can do there, I think the better. I just find I did a review a couple of years ago where the CEO said that the Neds can talk to any of my executives, and I don't expect my executives to report back to me about what's been said. We have a huge degree of trust amongst the executive team and between the executive team and the board, and that must be what it's about.
Chris.
I think it does depend a little bit on the nature of the organization. I mean, um, if you are a sort of dispersed organization with a number of manufacturing sites or warehouses, and a director's going to go and visit, then there is a sort of degree of courtesy to let the CEO know that that's what you're doing. And I think it is no more than that, sort of courtesy and letting them know what you plan. Um, I think there's a practical point there. If you are planning to go next week and they're planning to do a stock count in the warehouse, then it's not a great time to go. So the courtesy of just checking it's okay without it being a sort of gatekeeper exercise on the part of the CEO, I think is common sense. But it does depend, and I'm always a bit wary of sort of non-execs just walking around the head office, because I think those tend to be the environments where people are actually quite used to having directors and Neds around. But I think it is a matter of just deciding what's the best approach, but one that is, it allows Neds to really find out what's going on and have free conversation, but not in a sort of uncontrolled or sort of totally free for all sort of way, which I think could have its own dangers. So I think it's a matter of finding out what are the rules of the game that work for everyone, in a way that gives common courtesy to the whole protest.
And I think the common courtesy point is really important. And I think it's if you are going to try and do a visit, I think non-execs should think about what they're wanting to find out from the visit, why, and explain to the person they're visiting, the people they're visiting, what that is. That's another sort of common courtesy to show ways.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Just one other point, Leslie, sorry, I meant to say was sometimes it works quite well to have a couple of Neds go and do a visit together. Because I think it can act as a little bit of a constraint on the one Ned who wants to keep sort of really dig into the question. If you've got a sort of perhaps a more experienced person who kind of is more used to doing these visits versus someone who's just come on the board with an executive background and is probably tempted to sort of get into, well, why is this machine going wrong, or why is this happening? And you've got another Ned sort of say, no, it's time to move on. We've had enough on that one. And I think a couple of Neds, not the chair, not the necessarily a director that sort of has the experience in that area, but two of them going together can be quite an effective way of doing a site visit. Adds a little bit more weight to the visit, perhaps, but also having two directors report back to the board on a site visit can actually be quite a good sort of illumination of what's come out of the discussion.
Yeah. Thank you. So we've also had a couple of comments questions that come in around remuneration. One is sort of, do you think that does the higher Ned workload mean that Ned fees are trending higher? And in a crisis, would you expect to pay Neds more? That's on the first hand. And then the other one, it's sort of bearing in mind what's being discussed through the time commitment and perhaps the need to get younger people involved. Is this the right time to look at compensation?
I think yes. I mean, I think in terms of being paid for what they do, I do think remuneration or fees for directors has been in increasing I think the workload has been recognised in what fees are being paid. Possibly it's a lag factor there in terms of the workload is higher than the remuneration sort of progress. But as new roles and responsibilities have come on, so for example, the chair of uh, the director responsible for workforce engagement will get, who's quite often paid an additional fee for doing that, and I think that's absolutely right. Um, Obviously, the the approach I think is not really been reviewed in a very holistic way. I think it's just evolved out of what's gone before, and obviously there are sort of shareholder views on whether Ned should be, given sort of variable remuneration and so on, which instinctively is possibly right, but I think there could be an argument for reviewing that now, in light of the the additional responsibilities they have, and particularly that does come to a fore in a big transaction where all of a sudden your Neds are having to spend a huge number of hours on calls on board meetings. And I know in the past when the remuneration committee or the board has said, well, actually, you should be paying a one-off fee to reflect the time, the investors have pushed back so hard on that, and it doesn't seem particularly fair given what the work that's been done. So I feel that it's not in an ideal place on that. There has been some progress, but actually, it probably could do with a fresh look by all the relevant sort of stakeholders interested in that
Yeah,
particular topic.
sorry, Ian, you go.
You go, no, you go.
Okay, I think there's a particular spin on this in publicly owned boards, um, where the remuneration is low, um, and um, and you get either NEDs who just are purpose driven. They want to they're experienced NEDs. They worked, they've got great experience and great networks, and they want to contribute to that particular public body, publicly owned body, because for whatever values reason that they have. And that's fine, and that works well, and remuneration doesn't, they know they're usually individually wealthy, and they're not doing it for the money. There's another group, however, that I might highlight, who are less experienced Neds, who apply to publicly owned boards for positions, in the knowledge that the remuneration is low, so it's not as attractive a position. But actually, often these businesses and organizations are large and complicated. And actually, the requirement from the NED is higher in some ways. It's more sophisticated than it would be in a kind of straightforward corporate business. So there's an example where the remuneration and the role kind of counterbalance, they counter each other, and conflict, and you maybe get some inexperienced Neds in very experienced Ned positions, really, or positions that require very experienced Neds, I should say.
So to answer a specific question, the first thing I would say is I definitely wouldn't pay Neds more if it's a crisis. I think you take that role on the basis that there may be a crisis. Indeed, it might have been of the Ned's own making. So it seems a bit strange that they might be being rewarded for that. So I wouldn't do that. I'm afraid I'm slightly with the shareholders on M&A activity. I think there's a real danger if you start paying non-executives more because they get involved in M&A. You could get a very acquisitive CEO going through lots of deals, and the Neds might think, well, actually, the more I do this, the more I get paid. So personally, I wouldn't pay them more for M&A activity. It may be that we need to increase the base fee in the corporate sector. It's probably more difficult, and Alec will know better than I will doing that in the public sector. So maybe we need to do that. Definitely agree that we should be paying more for things like committees and whether you're the senior independent director. And I think most boards do that. Um, I mean, in terms of getting younger Neds, I think really effective CEOs, using that word again, really effective, want their executives to sit as Neds elsewhere, and will release them to do that. So I'm not sure that upping the compensation will necessarily get younger people on the board. We need younger people on the board anyway, and it's maybe ensuring that we have that awareness that there is a real benefit to having your executives sit on other boards as non-execs, not only for their own personal training and development, but actually also adds, I think, to the company where they're an executive.
Mm.
I've certainly done board reviews. I've interviewed Neds who are sitting executives, and they say, the company that I work for as an employee gets much more out of this than the company where I'm an ed. So I think we should look at that aspect rather than just thinking it's about remuneration or fees.
Thank you. We've got a question here about sort of the political dimension. And Damien's asked, he said, if today the business is operating that something that they support morally is the right thing, and a politician, I have no idea who he means here, stands out and says they think it's the wrong thing, what practically can boards do? I mean, how can they, if they feel they're rowing against the tide of changing political opinion, what should they do?
Well, I
Hard
mean,
question.
it's a hard question, things, and it's to my earlier point why boards where the if the government's the shareholder, it's even an even harder question. Um, uh, so I always come back to the fact that the greatest power that an NED or a chair has is the power to stay or go, actually. And so before you get to the red button, what are the other activities? Well, how much engagement and what's the quality of engagement with the regulator, the government, whoever the shareholder as government? What's the quality of that engagement? And it's not often that great, and sometimes it's intermediated by the civil service in ways that are not necessarily always helpful. So quality of engagement over time. So there is trust. So there is engagement, and there's understanding of motivation as well. And then really understanding that when we're recruiting for boards, in what we're trying to do. So if you take uh, take examples from, we've just changed government in this country, so a number of the initiatives have, or the needs of the government have changed in some cases quite radically. Um, are you timed out because of that? I'm doing board just now, and one or two are leaving and things, and that's fair enough, really. At this point, it's the right answer. There's no point fighting against it. Um, so that might be the case. There are other more complex situations where there are initiatives from the government, as we've seen in the US about DE&I and things like that actually have an enormous impact on whether a business needs to pivot, how it operates, and if that's some of its own internal values, what should be done about that. There needs to be good, strong conversation in the board around those issues, not simply knee-jerk reactions.
I think I think the whole question goes to the title of this webinar. I think it is about courage at board level, and I think that's one of the challenges that the current environment is really presenting boards, because I think really in many ways it's been easy for boards, relatively easy for boards to, sort of go with the flow um, on, whatever the sort of current thinking is around certain issues. Um, but if you take the sort of political environment around, let's say, sort of ESG or DEI, you are obviously seeing one point of view coming across from the US, and it has its adherents in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, but then you'll have others who think differently. And I think that the challenge for the board is to say, well, what do we think? What are our convictions that we need to have the courage of in this? And my worry, a bit like Alex's, is really that boards kind of put it a little bit in the too difficult file and just go for the expedient. Okay, we'll just change our policies. And you think, well, if I'm an employee in your organization, what's that telling me about your sort of adherent to corporate values that you were stating,
Yeah.
2 years ago or whatever? And I think, bearing in mind that a lot of these policies come from within the organization, I think the challenge that NEDs, I feel, should be making is say, well, what's the evaluation of this that you're changing? What is it that's what are the pros, what are the cons in terms of the organization sort of risk profile, in terms of the corporate values, in terms of the why we're doing this. And this is where I think you need courageous directors to be certainly asking the questions if they don't think that the questions are being asked or being considered in an appropriate way.
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with Chris using the word courage. I suppose for boards, that they do need to use courage in these in the type of circumstance that the question's talking about. But and this probably sounds a bit textbook answer, but you really need to go back to what are your director's duties? Who are your responsibilities and they're not necessarily to the government or government minister. And they're fundamentally going to be, you can list them out as the shareholders and other stakeholders. And so I think as a director, you've got to accept there may be occasions where you are unpopular. I mean, I'm thinking of some of the big utility companies that maybe sit on a water board, for example. That could be a big challenge at the moment. But I think you have to think of your stakeholders first. And it's a bit like when we talk about courage, and something I often talk about with boards and non-executives is that you've got to be prepared to be in a minority of one, and it's having that courage. And you may be against the tide of public opinion or political opinion, but the first and foremost, you've got to ensure you've complied with your duties as a director.
Yeah.
You're on mute.
Leslie.
You're on mute, Leslie.
Sorry, an ambulance went by and I turned myself off. So I think we're at the end of the webinar now. Thank you so much to all three of you. That was an absolutely fascinating discussion. I've had several comments coming in saying how interesting people have found it. Thank you to all the rest of you for those great questions and for engaging with us. We will be in touch again with the recording. As I say, it'll take about a week probably, but we will send you on the recording. And do let us know if there are any other topics you want to cover, and hope to see you at the next webinar. And thank you guys hugely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.